If you look at any statistics, the kind of cost of living on a relative basis for Canadians on a per capita basis is at like multi decade lows, right? I think maybe only like if you go back to the Great Depression or something, maybe it's probably lower back then, right? But it's been the lowest in my living lifetime, and I'm almost 30, right? So it's pretty bad, and it's a shame that the Canadian government just absolutely does not recognize how dire this situation is, and the Liberal government is somehow surprised when they put out this new budget that raises taxes a bunch of people, that their polling numbers go down. So the last graphic that I have on the docket is a picture of the latest polls from 338 Canada, which is a polling aggregator. And you can see the Liberals, which are in red, and their polling numbers just kind of plummeting. And they've been in straight decline since mid 2023. And it doesn't show signs of stopping anytime soon. So, yeah, apparently their policies are not working. And then they're also surprised that they're not working, which is incredibly frustrating. So, let me toss the question back to you guys. Do you guys have any responses to what I said? Do you agree with what I said? And yeah, what are your thoughts on Canada's situation in general, and what role that economic policy of the government has had to play in this crisis that we're facing?
I'll go really quick here. I think I'll just piggyback off that like 338 Canada popular vote projection. Um, it's not even just in the Western Hemisphere. I think it's also in the Eastern Hemisphere, if I said that correctly. Like, there's a lot of news in like the European Union of a lot of political systems leaning towards another direction. Maybe it's just because people are tired of like one way, and it's time for like the switch. Um, I support like damn, what am I gonna say here? I'm pretty neutral, but like I'm typically like a liberal, but I think it when one side is like going on for too long, it's time to switch, and then maybe eventually there's going to be a switch again, and then I guess people are starting to realize that. So not only here in Canada, I think society is switching to like another direction. It seems it's very like left focused right now, I guess. But I don't want to say too much about that. I'll stay neutral as possible. I'll support whoever does the best for the citizens of Canada and the rest of the world too as well. So, and I think the policies that you were stating and like the issues and problems that you, by the way, you previously mentioned in like other episodes of the podcast too, I think would be a better way to like combat with like using the tax instead of like regulating like uh whatever you want to call it. Is it CTR? I forgot, but regulating like Canadian media to make it seem like everything's more Canadian. I think fixing the problems that you mentioned instead would be like a lot better. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I'm sure Tristan has a lot more to chime into as well. So get to that.
Yeah, I'll kind of I think this kind of alludes to what I was kind of speaking to previously. I don't particularly like taxes that I feel like don't do anything. They don't provide any value. And the problem with the liberals the last little bit is that they've seemingly been adding a lot of taxes that don't really do anything. Because, in my opinion, the CRTC stuff, obviously, as I mentioned before, doesn't really do anything. There's like basically very little value that I see for having that tax go into that government tool, whatever it is, organization. Um, so I don't see much value in my life. And honestly, I don't think most people will see much value from that. And it's not to say that we shouldn't support Canadian content. It's just that I don't think that we should be expecting I don't think we should be trying to fund it and then kind of ram it down our throats, right? Like I think that the Canadian content should kind of stand on its own 2 feet, rather than be shoved down our throats so that we can only consume it over something else. And it's not to say that like they shouldn't make efforts to put Canadian content, give maybe more opportunities to have Canadian content where they, like singers, for example, like allow them to get a platform so that they can grow into a more of a larger one, and maybe some incentives for that is fine. But again, it's just like adding this additional tax in to give us something that is basically something nobody asked for seems really not ideal. And then with regards to the carbon tax, we kind of beat this one to death a little bit, but again, it's just kind of feels like the carbon tax doesn't really, whether it is or isn't going to make the average person's money back. It really feels like the main thing with the carbon tax is just a reshuffling of money rather than an actual tax that something beneficial will come out of at the end, right? It's not like we're doing this carbon tax and then I turn around and the entire Alberta is now off natural gas. We're a completely green energy now. Great. No, it's like just I take money from this spot and I give it to this spot, and that just feels like, and it feels like it's not really super beneficial to the average person. I think that and I think that a lot of these taxes are kind of falling in that range where it's just no, I don't think anyone can really see the value proposition that they're receiving. And so I think it's a lot easier to justify paying taxes when you can see the value proposition, right? Like and the problem with the way they've kind of set it up is that because of how all these additional taxes that we're seeing coming in with no additional gain to ourselves, and then we have all these other problems that our taxes should be paying for that are still ongoing. And then it's kind of like, why am I paying all this tax and then not receiving the value that I'm expecting to get from paying that tax? Like, why? And if I'm not going to receive it, why am I paying the tax?
That's a really good point. And just a hammer on that, like, because I've gotten into like Twitter fights with like random strangers when I like come out against the carbon tax, because it's like, a lot of people, I don't know, I feel like there's a certain portion of people, and maybe it's magnified on Twitter because people are polarized, like super polarized on Twitter. But there's a small percentage of Canadians, I feel, that are somehow like, of this belief that they're, morally superior, doing such a great thing by paying this carbon tax. And they're so happily willing to give the government their money for whatever reason. I can't fathom why. Right. And then when I come out against the carbon tax, they're like, oh, you hate the environment. You just want the oil companies to screw us over and over again. You want the oil companies to like pollute us and destroy our environment. And it's like, no, like, let me toss the question back to you, actually. Like, can you name one thing that the carbon tax made better environmentally, right? Like, I've actually asked people this, and there's no one that can name one thing specifically, right? Like, don't just say it made the environment better in general, because even if you say that, that's a statement that lacks evidence, in my opinion. But point to one thing, right? Just be like, hey, here in like southern Alberta, like, we got a new conservatory for animals because it was funded by the carbon tax, where it wouldn't have happened before if the carbon tax didn't exist. Or like, name something, right? Name a project that the carbon tax helped fund. Name something, right? I haven't heard of a single thing that the carbon tax went into. And then when I bring up this fact, people are like, oh, just go do some research, right? Go do some research. And like, I'm sure there are programs that the carbon tax funded. It's like, okay, first of all, I've tried and I haven't found any. And second of all, if they're buried that deep that I can't like even look, I can't even find one program that was funded by the carbon tax after like 5 pages of Google, then like, maybe it's up to maybe it's the government's fault, right? Like, maybe they're the ones that are not spending this money properly. And in fact, I know they're not spending this money properly because they're giving it out to people in the form of a carbon rebate. And I got a carbon rebate too, right? And guess what I did with my carbon rebate? I went out and I bought a tank of gas. So a lot of the times I feel like, people just assume that, oh, because it's a carbon tax and the government's going to take this money and make the environment better, I'll just believe them and happily volunteer my money. And it's like, you guys need to think a little bit deeper, right? Like, I'm open to more taxation if it means that the money is actually being well spent. But I think it's pretty clear to me, and I don't see how you could see it any like other case, that the carbon tax money is not being well spent. And maybe the last point, and then we'll wrap up. So looking back at this poll, this 338 poll, there's 25% of Canadians that are still supportive of the Liberals, despite all the bad policies that we've discussed on this channel, on previous episodes, this episode and previous episodes. So that 25%, that's pretty significant. That's a quarter, right, of all Canadians are still supportive of the Liberals. And my question is, why? Like just why? like explain to me. Like, I'm not trying to be like super partisan. I'm just like, because I can see somebody explore like supporting the NDP, right? Because they're like, you can make an argument that, hey, like, they're a left-leaning party and they're more similar to the Liberals compared to the Conservatives, and I don't want to vote the Conservatives because I don't want to vote for a right-wing party, and the NDP has never been in charge, so let's give them a chance, right? So I can see how somebody would maybe justify voting for the NDP, but why would someone still vote for the Liberals after all they've done? Like, I'm really trying to understand, right? Listen, I know it sounded like I'm just being super biased and being super partisan, but just put yourselves in the shoes of a Liberal supporter and like think things through with the logic. And I can't arrive at a logical conclusion as to why somebody would still support Trudeau at this point. But maybe you guys, by you guys I mean Dom and Tristan, maybe you guys can, and maybe even audience members, put it down in the comments. If you are a Liberal supporter, explain why, or if you're not a Liberal supporter, explain why you think people are still supportive of the Liberals. But yeah, anyways, let me toss the question back to you guys. Like, why are there still 1 in 4 Canadians that are still supportive of Trudeau?
I think I'll just like wrap this up real quick. It's the difference between conservative people who are probably sick and tired of all these policies and like are drowning in like like liabilities and payments and debts that are like, oh, we just need a government change because I want to be able to afford things. Like, I'm sick and tired of the circumstances of society and the economics and etc. But with the people who support the Liberal Party are probably doing well, and they prioritize like people's rights and stuff like that. So I can see why people would still vote Liberal, just because I think the rights of like people and humans are still a good thing. But in hindsight, they're probably like really wealthy and live in like Bridalwood, like Toronto, like same area as Drake or something, and are probably like filthy rich, so they don't have to worry about like slight conveniences like the carbon tax versus like the average Canadian who does have to worry about carbon tax and it being really expensive, and that being like the difference between food on the table and not. And I suppose that's why people are voting conservative, because they just want to change. But people want to be liberal still just because they still got money in the bank. I'm pretty sure that's it, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, so I think that I can kind of uh, guesstimate why the people are still liberal, and I think that there's going to be a few buckets of people. So, for example, I think there's one bucket of people who has always voted liberal. That they voted liberal in the last election, they're going to vote liberal in the next election. They're going to vote liberal from the day they were born to the day they die. Right? There's going to be some people who are just lifelong liberals. Same thing with conservatives. There's always people in these camps that they're like, red's my color, blue's my color, orange is my color. I don't care besides that. I've always voted for the blues. I've always voted for the reds, right? So I think that is definitely an aspect. Now, that's not to say that is the majority of people. I just want to add that as a fairly consistent reason that anyone votes for any of these parties at a consistent basis. regardless of their value proposition. Because again, I don't think most people know what the value proposition of each of these political parties are to themselves. Oftentimes, I found it that people tend to vote against their best wishes or their best interests, election wise, either way. So anyway, to bring it back to the question of why people would be voting for the Liberals, and I think that there's going to be another camp that would be the people who don't think the NDP ever have a chance of getting in. So they aren't going to throw their vote away into the NDP camp, and they definitely don't want the Conservatives, so they aren't going to vote for the Conservatives. So they're in a spot where their only option is the Liberals, at least in their mind, because the NDP is essentially akin to throwing away your vote, in their opinion, because they're never going to get into power. And then their alternative is the Conservatives, and they don't like the Conservatives. So I think there's a large group of people who are in there. And I think that those people tend to be the people who are like on like Reddit and stuff, who are like the people who are like, ooh, Trudeau's not that bad. You know, I think it's mostly those kind of people who are like trying to kind of justify their opinion that the Conservatives are bad. Trudeau isn't that bad. And that the Liberals are better than the NDP because the NDP is never going to get elected. And so they're kind of having to defend a weak Liberal government because of that fact, because they've kind of put themselves in a position where they're you know, they don't believe in any of the other parties as much as they believe in the Liberals, and they've kind of just put themselves in a box. And so in that regard, I don't think that I think most of the people who are swing voters, I think, have left the Liberal camp. So I think we're getting down to like the people who are too politically left to ever vote Conservative, but don't believe the NDP is going to win, or they are. And I think there's also maybe a smaller subset that is too centrist, but don't like the Conservatives. Maybe they just don't like Pierre, who will still vote Liberal because they don't like Pierre, and the NDP is too left. So I think there's going to be a box there. So I think that there's a fair number of reasons why one would vote the Liberal, but I think it's pretty clear to me that the majority of the people who are kind of in the swing voter camp, where they're like, sometimes I vote Liberal, sometimes I vote Conservative, sometimes I vote NDP, depending on what the policies they're offering are. I think pretty much all of those people have jumped ship from the Liberals. And I think that's what we're really seeing with the Liberal approval rate tanking, I think, is that those swing voters just dipping all sides, either to NDP or to the Conservatives.
I'll say, like, I'm one of those swing voters, right? Like, sometimes I vote Liberal, sometimes I vote Conservatives, and sometimes I voted NDP in the past too. You know, that might have been a surprising fact to people who have watched me, because it doesn't seem like it that I would vote NDP, but I have, right? And yeah, I just think that so I'm being a swing voter. I think I'm trying to be like in the middle, right? But I just think that given the track record of what the Liberals have done in the past few years, I think it's absolutely nuts that people are willing to vote for the Liberals again and give them power for another 4 years, given what has happened in the past 4 years or so. But yeah, I mean, it's just, it's like, you know, one of those like movies where you got betrayed by your best friend, and like, like your best friend has like a gun to your head and they're about to shoot you. And then at that point, you're just giving up. You're just defeated. You're not even mad. You're just like, you can shoot me, just tell me why. Right? Like, I'm at that point where it's like there's 25%, and those 1 in 4 Canadians are still willing to give Trudeau another 4 years. And at this point, I'm like, I'm not even mad. Just tell me why.